Hi folks, and welcome once again to Men of the Infinite, your dedicated wisdom channel. In this video I'd like to address an argument that some theists like to throw at atheists regarding not so much the truth of atheism in a metaphysical or ontological sense, but in a pragmatic sense, in the sense of the livability of atheism. In other words, it's a utilitarian argument they like to make. And the specific context of that argument is the realization that there exists no ultimate or objective meaning and purpose. Basically, these theists claim that this worldview, and I'm not going to technically argue the correctness of that worldview here, I'm going to take it as valid by default. These theists argue that such a realization or worldview results in certain psychological difficulties, namely a kind of existential angst, perhaps even crisis, a kind of despair. Some go so far as to use Russell's terminology, unyielding despair, or perhaps just a general unease about the fact that no ultimate or objective meaning and purpose exists. Now, the first thing to be said about that argument is that these theists probably don't realize that in making that argument, what they're doing is saying something about their own psychology. That is, they're putting themselves in the shoes of an atheist and considering what their psychological response to such a realization would be. So in effect, they're really talking about themselves and their own capacities or incapacities. That said, they are nevertheless pointing to something that is real. Most atheists, whilst as far as I can tell living fairly well with the consequences of such a realization, will nevertheless experience some kind of unease with respect to it. Now, as an individual, you can decide the level of unease that you have in fact experienced. For some people, it may well come down to genuine existential angst. But for most people, it will be there because it's a natural part of human psychology. But what I want to do in this video is identify the source of that psychological response so that people can look at it, examine it, and ultimately eliminate it. And the source of that psychological response, that unease or despair or whatever it is that a person might experience in the face of the realization that no ultimate or objective meaning and purpose exists, is our egos. It arises purely because of the ego. It's the functioning of that ego that causes those psychological difficulties. The ego works by, in part at least, contrast or relation to or identification with and attachment to and the grasping at objective realities, realities outside of its own subjective sphere. This is how it grants identity to itself, how it gives its reality concretion. So when you strip away a source of the ego's identification, it fights back. The angst we experience at such a realization is, in effect, the ego fighting for its own life and existence. The angst we feel is the battle that the ego is waging against such an intellectual realization. Now, some people would probably argue that there are certain aspects of our psychology that are more or less hardwired, and we sort of have to just learn to live with them, and this would be one of them. But that's just not true. The kind of dissonance that exists within our minds, wherein we can understand something intellectually, such as the non-existence of God, but then a part of us, some emotional part of us, would prefer that God actually existed. And that's what's happening here with the issue of purpose and meaning. Those desires and those modes of thought are at their core delusional. And there's no reason that we need to put up with delusional desires and modes of thinking. They're not hardwired. We don't have to simply live with them. We can examine them, get to the source, and strangle the damn life out of it, and eliminate them permanently. But that takes work and philosophical effort. It's up to you whether you desire that result enough to make the effort. It's not enough for atheists to say, look, we bring purpose and meaning into the world via our consciousness. That's how those things arise. Teleology arises out of human consciousness. I mean, that's true. It's perfectly true. And it's a legitimate response to the point that theists are making. But it doesn't entirely address it because lurking behind that fact is the other fact of that psychological reality, that psychological difficulty that does exist because of the functioning of the ego. And if you haven't eliminated your ego, it is there, doing what it does. So the next time a theist puts that particular argument to you, you can say, yes, I agree that that difficulty arises, but we atheists are working at it. We're looking at the causes and reasons for that difficulty and attempting to eliminate them, whereas you theists are doing everything that you possibly can to reinforce your egos. And when that theist says, I really can't imagine being able to live with the atheist worldview, you can simply say to them, well, no, I can't imagine you living without your delusions either.